The 7 original Mercury astronauts were household names across America for decades, and many of these names remain as such to this day. But strangely enough, one of the least remembered happens to be the one who accomplished the most, flying every original NASA spacecraft, Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo. That man was Walter Marty Schirra Jr., known to his friends as Wally. Born in Hackensack, New Jersey on March 12, 1923 to a family of aviators, he had flying in the blood since his birth, himself flying by the time he was 15. First attending the Newark College of Engineering, Schirra was later appointed to the United States Naval Academy, achieving a Bachelor of Science degree in 1945 upon gaining his Navy commission. Though his graduating class was 1946, he received the degree early in order to support the demands of World War II, now nearing its conclusion. He subsequently served in the final months of the war aboard the USS Alaska, a large battlecruiser of the day. Returning to flight school, Schirra received his wings from the Naval Air Station Pensacola in Florida, and joining VF-71, a carrier fighter squadron, becoming only the second Navy pilot to log 1,000 hours in jet aircraft. Between 1951 and 1952, Schirra would see serious combat, flying 90 combat missions during the Korean War as part of 2 Air Force squadrons during an exchange program between the Air Force and Navy at the time, earning him the Distinguished Flying Cross and 2 air medals by war's end. 1957 is when his test pilot career began, attending both the Naval Air Safety Officer School and the U.S. Naval Test Pilot School. During a test at the Naval Ordnance Test Station, Schirra was testing the new F-7U-3 Cutlass fighter bomber, as well as the new Sidewinder missile. During one flight, he'd fired one of the missiles, only to find the missile turn around and fly straight back at him, chasing his jet. It was only his skillful flying ability that allowed him to not only survive the incident, but actually outfly the Sidewinder, returning his aircraft to base undamaged. He would go on to test such notable aircraft as the F-4 Phantom II before receiving the invitation in 1959 to join 109 other test pilots to try out for Project Mercury. While most who joined this test were excited and eager, Wally's first impression of the project was a bit less enthusiastic.
I can recall my own reaction when a bunch of idiots.
Arrive in this big auditorium at the Pentagon with about 70 guys, 2 engineers and a shrink trying to tell us about how exciting it would be to get in a capsule on top of a rocket. And I said, where the hell's the no desk? Then to make us feel better, they said, well, don't worry, we're going to send a chimpanzee first. Where the hell is the no desk?
But as with all who had their doubts, the more information he got, the better the program looked. And upon working through all the grueling tests subjected upon him, Schirra came out on top as one of the 7 Mercury astronauts. As all 7 would have specific duties within Mercury's development, Schirra's area of responsibility was in developing environmental controls and life support systems for the spacecraft, ensuring safety and comfort throughout operational flight. This also made him the proverbial guinea pig to test out the environmental suit to its completion. All test pilots have a natural arrogance about them, feeling that they are the best, better than anyone else, especially in this group of 7 who are paraded around for America as the greatest pilots on the planet. This creates some understandable tension when a decision has to be made as to who flies first. Essentially, in their mind, who is the absolute best? That moment came when Bob Gilruth, director of the Manned Spacecraft Center, told the 7 that the first flights belonged to Alan Shepard, Gus Grissom, and John Glenn.
I can recall really feeling deflated, because this is one of those rare times when you didn't make the mark, or at least I hadn't. And here were Slayton, Carpenter, Cooper, and myself, second team. A very, very traumatic feeling.
A feeling that can only fully be understood by those who achieve such high ranking on the world stage, when being the absolute best is all one lived for. Even so, there was still a job to do, and Schirra would do it to the best of his ability, serving in various duties throughout flight operations, notably as California Capcom during John Glenn's flight. And now, with these first 3 flights concluded, Schirra found himself in the flight line, serving as backup for Deke Slayton's orbital flight of Delta 7. As with all backup pilots, Schirra trained diligently right alongside Slayton, up to the point when NASA doctors started getting nervous about Slayton's heart fibrillation, pulling him from flight status and grounding him indefinitely.
I was off on a trip somewhere. I remember I flew back into Langley in one of our planes, probably a 102, and landed and came by Scott Carpenter and Reen Carpenter's quarters, and my wife was there and the rest of the gang. And as I drove up my little flashy yellow Healy, Scott came out before I even got to join the group and said, Wally, we got a problem. Deke's grounded. Immediately I thought, oh, God, it's my flight. And Scott looked at me and said, no, it's not your flight, as if he read my mind. He said, it's my flight, and you'll be my backup. Thud. Another shot in the rear end.
Carpenter was instead selected to fly the 4th Mercury flight, primarily because he had served as backup for John Glenn, and NASA administration felt he was better prepared to follow in Glenn's footsteps, as it were. But deflation would not last long, as Schirra's turn would finally come in October 1962. Glenn and Carpenter had many difficulties during their flights, certain glitches and errors that remained as unfortunate blemishes in their heroic conquests of space. Schirra, on the other hand, is best known for making the best textbook flight of the entire Mercury program. His craft, Sigma 7, completing 6 orbits over a period of 9 hours, landing within sight of his recovery ship, and suffering no malfunctions or flight errors. The first totally successful orbital flight of the United States. Wally was a precision pilot. He loved doing everything perfectly, relying on his skill to get it done, without distraction or unnecessary side projects. When he was selected to fly the first orbital rendezvous in the flight of Gemini 6 in 1965, he found himself back in the seat to do exactly what he loved. Pure precision flying with almost no science experiments. The mission was to launch and meet up with Gemini 7, already in orbit, to test if 2 spacecraft could maneuver close enough to each other to allow docking. Schirra joined Tom Stafford in what was to be the 5th launch of a Gemini Titan, but were about to make history in a different way.
Perfect countdown, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Clock started, no liftoff. It was much more traumatic than that, of course. But it happened, the engines came up to speed, and it stopped. And but logic, this is all millisecond logic, said, hey, we haven't lifted off. If we had lifted off, and it started to shut down, our recourse was to eject out of there, and I would pull this ring between my legs and it would eject both of us out from the spacecraft.
The statistics were that 75% of ejections were successful, and the definition of successful was that the guy didn't get killed.
For the first time in American manned spaceflight, a launch was aborted. The engines fired but immediately shut down, leaving the fully fueled rocket with the 2 men on top, sitting anxiously on the pad.
All packs are ready.
Okay, no problem on these tanks?
Negative.
Okay, we're just sitting here breathing.
What happened, a wire had come loose on this case, and that caused this short, which then shut down the engine. But when you think about the engineers and who came out there and re-rigged that, that's unreal.
With the mission still needing to be performed, and Gemini 7 still awaiting its rendezvous craft, engineers isolate the problem and get Gemini 6 ready to launch only 3 days later. And just as Schirra does best, a perfect rendezvous and a perfect flight, accomplishing all of the mission's objectives and returning to Earth safely. Of course, he would have a little fun with his colleague Frank Borman over in Gemini 7 during his rendezvous.
Borman was a class of 50 out of West Point. So we got very close to the other spacecraft. Tom held up the sign that we had prearranged, beat Army. 3 Navy guys against 1 out of West Point. The sequel to that, though, which was really horrible, Borman said, look at that sign, it says beat Navy. Tom pulls it down, looks at it. So we lost the verbal transition.
Schirra was always known for his sense of humor. often referred to as Jolly Wally, and most often, no one appreciated Wally's sense of humor more than Wally. Even so, when asked if he was apprehensive or nervous about the program, his simple response would be, "Levity is the lubricant of crises." But even his levity could not prepare him for what was about to happen. In 1967, 3 brave American astronauts lost their lives in the fire of Apollo 1. Schirra and his 2 crew members found themselves with the unenviable task of putting the program back on track in the mission of Apollo 7. It was about here that the typical jovial jock pilot began to lose some of his humor, and many would find themselves wishing for the annoying jokester to return.
I had fun with Mercury. I had fun with Gemini. I lose a buddy, my next-door neighbor, Gus, one of our 7. I lose 2 other guys I thought the world of. And I began to realize this was no longer fun. I was now assigned a mission where I had to put it back on track, like Humpty Dumpty.
The fact that Schirra was making history as the first man to fly 3 times, and the first man to fly all 3 spacecraft, made little importance to him. He wanted to make another perfect flight, but Apollo 7 was not a short list of objectives. This was a full 10-day endurance test of the new spacecraft. There were already many objectives to accomplish, including rendezvous maneuvers with the separated Saturn IVB stage still in orbit with them. Schirra had already voiced objections about adding experiments to the flight plan before the flight, and now NASA was attempting to add more such objectives while the flight was already in progress.
They decided on a Saturday morning, we launched on a Friday, to turn on television. I was asleep and Don Isley was on watch. And I heard Don saying something about, Wally's not going to like that.
Roger, regarding the flight plan problem here, we would just ask to reconsider that.
And they said, well, the NASA PR guys want to have television today because they've got some quiet time. They can get national media. I said, sorry about that, guys. We're not ready yet.
We have a new vehicle up here. I'm saying at this point TV will be delayed without any further discussion until after the rendezvous.
Roger, copy.
TV transmissions, experiments, little jobs and distractions, exactly what Wally had always hated, and he made sure they knew it.
I've had it up here today, and from now on I'm going to be an onboard flight director for these updates. We're not going to accept any new games, like getting 50 feet to the Delta V tower for a burn, or doing some crazy tests we've never heard of before. As a result, each test is going to be reviewed thoroughly before we act on it.
I was the flight director, the prime flight director, and I was on console at the time. And I was pissed off about it. That was an affront and inappropriate and frankly insubordinate.
Don and I would just, kind of look at each other and cringe inside at some of the exchanges that were going on. Keep in mind that, Wally had been around. This was his 3rd mission, and he was kind of the cock of the walk, or at least he thought he was.
It was not a simple matter of feeling in charge or disagreeing with management. Schirra had developed a bad head cold during the flight, which had only served to magnify his frustrations far more than they otherwise would have been.
I've taken 2 aspirin, and I'm wondering if there's anything else I can take. Roger.
These problems would persist throughout the entire flight, all the way up to re-entry, and the final argument involved the helmet. What Schirra had feared is while wearing the bubble helmet, he would be unable to hold his nose to equalize his plugged ears as the pressure increased from the spacecraft's 5 psi atmosphere to sea level 14.8 upon landing. Mission rules, however, stated that the helmets must be on. This is, of course, for safety, as the forces of impact as the spacecraft hits the water could cause the astronaut to crack his head open upon the seat restraints.
In this case, I had a cold, and I felt that I had enough discussion with the ground. I didn't have much more time to talk about whether they're going to put the helmet on or off, leave the bubble helmet on or off. I said, essentially, I'm on board. I'm commanding. They could wear all the black armbands they wanted if I was lost or lost my hearing, but I had the responsibility for living through the mission.
Finally, Schirra was given a direct order to leave the helmet on. His direct answer was to disobey that direct order.
That's pure bullshit. I think Schirra was paranoid.
What is something nice about me?
Apollo 7 was the only flight of its type. It was the only time when, in flight, the flight crews were openly difficult to deal with and hostile towards some of the things that we were trying to do.
Paranoid and Jekyll Hyde might come out of all that, but I really wanted to do everything perfectly.
The flight was a complete success, and despite the 10 days of bickering, all objectives were completed, and the spacecraft performed in an exemplary fashion. But when discipline must be maintained, the flight director made sure that none of the 3 astronauts involved would ever fly again. While the difficulties were primarily on Schirra's shoulders, he had announced before the flight of Apollo 7 that it would be his final flight. So his crewmates Don Isley and Walt Cunningham essentially absorbed the brunt of the punishment instead. What had become the most famous head cold in NASA history would end up giving Schirra a new kind of fame after his retirement. A still experimental antihistamine tablet was used on Apollo 7 in the attempt to reduce his cold symptoms. When the medicine became available over the counter as Actifed years later, the makers had actually hired Schirra to serve as a television spokesperson for the prescription medicine.
It's a nasal decongestant antihistamine tablet.
The great line, of course, where I got a Clio for that was, did you ever sneeze in one of these? And here's that same bubble helmet.
Can you imagine sneezing in one of these? I'm Wally Schirra. Suffering cold symptoms in space can't be fun.
After his retirement, Schirra spent a decade serving for several different investment groups and energy corporations until forming his own firm, Schirra Enterprises, in 1979. A few years later, he joined with the surviving Mercury veterans and Grissom's widow Betty to form the Mercury Seven Foundation in order to raise money for science and engineering scholarships. This group would be renamed to the Astronaut Scholarship Foundation in 1995. He would continue to write several books and biographies on himself and spaceflight in following years, including appearing in many such video programs himself, where his jolly old self returns quite often, also becoming a major contributor to the book In the Shadow of the Moon, written in 2007. It would be that year that Schirra underwent treatment for abdominal cancer, dying of a heart attack on May 3rd at the age of 84. A memorial service was held on May 22nd of that year at the Fort Rosecrans National Cemetery in California, including a flyover tribute by 3 FA-18 Hornet aircraft. His ashes later committed to the sea from the Nimitz-class carrier USS Ronald Reagan on February 11, 2008. Schirra may have been a joker that got on people's nerves now and then, and he may have been overly passionate during Apollo 7, but no one can argue with his skill or his accomplishments. He believed in his work and in the program, and was instrumental in many key aspects that would make the historic landing upon the moon possible. RadiOdyssey and Cymax Media salute Walter M. Schirra Jr., a man whose life and legacy will forever mark this week in space history.